Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I was hired on the dark web by the government to study UFOs. What I found out made me quit and go into hiding. I've always been one of those people who just can't let things go. You know the type. If there's a mystery, I need to solve it. If there's a puzzle, I have to figure it out. That's probably why I've spent more time than I'd like to admit on the darker corners of the internet, poking around where most people would never dare to look. I'd heard all the horror stories about the dark web, but to me, it was just another place to satisfy my curiosity. It wasn't until I stumbled upon a job offer that things started to get weird, really weird. It all started a few months ago. I was browsing through some forums, following a trail of cryptic messages that hinted at some kind of secret government project. Most of it was probably just the usual nonsense, paranoia, conspiracy theories, that kind of stuff. But then, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a post, buried deep in a thread that seemed like it wasn't meant to be found. The title was simple: Seeking Researchers, Top Pay, High Risk. I hesitated for a moment. I'd seen posts like this before, usually leading to some shady scam or worse. But this one felt different. It wasn't just the promise of top pay that intrigued me. It was the way the post was written. It had a sense of urgency, like the person who posted it was desperate to find someone. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it. The details were vague. They needed someone with a background in research, particularly in areas that involved unexplained phenomena. They didn't go into specifics, but the mention of the dark web and the hidden nature of the project was enough to pique my interest. At the bottom of the post was a contact email, encrypted, of course. I should have walked away. I knew better, but something about the whole thing just felt compelling. Maybe it was the promise of a new mystery to unravel, or maybe I was just bored out of my mind. Either way, I couldn't resist. I copied the email address, decrypted it, and sent a message expressing my interest. It didn't take long to get a response. The reply was almost immediate, like they had been waiting for someone like me. The email was terse, direct, and to the point. They wanted to meet, in person. That should have been my first red flag. Who arranges an in-person meeting from a job offer on the dark web? But I guess my curiosity got the better of me. They told me to come to a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where no one asks questions and the regulars don't bother to look up from their newspapers when you walk in. I was supposed to ask for a Mr. Smith. I kid you not, that was the name they gave me. The day of the meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a huge mistake, but something kept pushing me forward. When I arrived at the cafe, it was exactly what I expected, dimly lit, with a few old-timers nursing their coffees in silence. I went up to the counter and asked for Mr. Smith. The barista didn't even blink. She nodded towards a booth in the back, where a man in a dark suit sat, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked like he'd stepped out of a 1950s spy movie. Clean cut, no nonsense, with an air of authority that made it clear he was not someone to mess with. "Mr. Smith, I presume?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I slid into the booth opposite him. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "That's correct," he replied. "You must be our new recruit." I nodded, unsure of what to say next. The whole situation felt surreal, like I'd stepped into a different world. We sat in silence for a moment before he finally spoke again. "You've been selected for a very important project," he said, his voice low and measured. "One that requires absolute discretion and a willingness to go beyond the ordinary." "What kind of project?" I asked, trying to sound casual, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. He leaned in closer, his eyes boring into mine. "We need someone to help us investigate certain anomalies, things that can't be explained by conventional science." I frowned. "Anomalies? You mean like UFOs?" His lips twitched slightly, almost like he was suppressing a smile. "Something like that," he replied. "Let's just say there are things out there that most people aren't ready to know about, but we need to understand them, and that's where you come in." The more he talked, the more I felt like I was being drawn into something way over my head. But there was also this undeniable pull, a need to know what he was talking about, to understand the mysteries he hinted at. "There's one condition," he added, his tone turning serious. "Once you're in, there's no backing out. You're either committed or you're not." I hesitated. This was the moment where I could have walked away, told him I wasn't interested, and gone back to my normal, boring life. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself nodding. "I'm in," I said, the words coming out almost automatically. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Good. You'll receive further instructions soon." And with that, he stood up, leaving a few bills on the table to cover his coffee. As he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just made a deal with the devil. I didn't know it then, but that meeting was the beginning of something that would change my life forever. What I found out in the weeks that followed would haunt me, and what I'm about to share with you now, well, let's just say I'm breaking every rule by doing so. But you deserve to know the truth. A few days after the meeting at the cafe, I received a package. It was dropped off at my front door. No return address, no markings, just a plain brown box, the kind you might use to send a birthday gift. But I knew this wasn't from any friend or family member. Inside the box was a small black laptop. No logos, no brand name, just a matte black finish, with a single sticky note on the screen that read, "Follow the instructions. Do not deviate." My heart was racing as I powered it on. The screen flickered to life, and after a moment, a single line of text appeared. "Welcome, Agent. Your first mission awaits. Prepare for briefing." I wasn't sure what I expected, but this was starting to feel like something out of a spy movie. A part of me was still convinced this was some elaborate prank, but the rest of me was intrigued. The screen changed, and a grainy video began to play. The footage was shaky, as if it had been recorded by someone in a hurry. It showed a dense forest, the camera panning wildly as the person behind it ran through the trees. I could hear heavy breathing, a few muttered curses, and then, in the distance, a sound that sent chills down my spine. It was a low hum, almost like the sound of electricity crackling in the air. But there was something else mixed in, something alive. I couldn't quite place it, but it made my skin crawl. The camera kept moving, and suddenly, the person recording stumbled into a clearing. The image stabilized for a moment, and that's when I saw it. In the middle of the clearing, half hidden by the trees, was an object. It was large, metallic, and definitely not of this world. It looked like something you'd expect to see in a sci-fi movie. Sleek, with smooth, curved edges that reflected the pale moonlight. The camera zoomed in, and for a moment, I thought I could see strange symbols etched into its surface. Then, the sound returned. That eerie, electrical hum, now growing louder, more intense. The person recording started to back away, their breathing becoming more frantic. The camera's focus shifted, and I caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. Something tall, thin, and impossibly fast. The video cut off abruptly, leaving me staring at a black screen. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I had just seen. Was this real, or some kind of elaborate hoax? Before I could think too much about it, more text appeared on the screen. You have 24 hours to reach the site. Coordinates will be provided. Do not alert anyone. Report your findings directly to us. The laptop shut itself off after that, leaving me in stunned silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to decide what to do. Every logical part of me was screaming to walk away, to forget I had ever seen any of this. But there was another part of me, a darker, more curious part, that needed to know the truth. By the time I made up my mind, the sun was beginning to set. I packed a bag with essentials, food, water, a flashlight, and made sure my phone was fully charged. I knew the coordinates were likely remote, so I also grabbed a map and compass, just in case. The last thing I wanted was to get lost in the middle of nowhere. When the coordinates finally arrived, I wasn't surprised to see that they pointed to a remote location deep in the woods, several hours away from any major roads. It was the kind of place where you could disappear without a trace and no one would ever know. The drive there was uneventful, but the closer I got, the more anxious I became. My thoughts kept returning to that video, those strange sounds, the metallic object, and whatever it was lurking in the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something far beyond my understanding, but there was no turning back now. I reached the edge of the forest just as night was falling. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I parked my car on the side of a dirt road and double-checked my gear before heading into the woods. The map I had was rudimentary at best, but the coordinates were clear, and after a bit of orientation, I started moving in the right direction. The deeper I went into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees were tall, their branches tangled together overhead, blocking out the moonlight. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the clearing. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the same scene I had seen in the video. The object was there, just as the video had shown, its metallic surface gleaming faintly in the dark. But now, standing in front of it, I could see that the symbols etched into it were glowing with a faint, eerie light. I slowly approached the object, my heart pounding in my chest. The hum was back too, vibrating through the air, stronger than before. I reached out to touch the surface, and as my fingers made contact, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. That's when I saw it, a shadow, just at the edge of the clearing, moving inhumanly fast. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the light caught something reflective. Eyes, staring back at me from the darkness. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The shadow moved closer, its form becoming clearer. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural ways. And those eyes, those glowing eyes, were locked onto me, filled with an intelligence that I couldn't comprehend. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't here by accident. It had been waiting for me. I don't remember much after that. Just a rush of adrenaline, my legs finally kicking into gear, and then the frantic sprint through the woods, crashing through branches and stumbling over roots. The hum returned, louder and more aggressive, as if the entire forest was coming alive around me. I didn't dare look back. By some miracle, I made it back to my car. I threw myself inside, slammed the door shut, and peeled out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city, surrounded by the comforting glow of streetlights and the distant hum of traffic. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever I had encountered in those woods wasn't finished with me yet. The laptop was waiting for me when I got home, and as much as I wanted to ignore it, I knew I couldn't. This was only the beginning, and whatever I had stumbled into, it was far from over. The following morning, I woke up to a nightmare that hadn't ended with the dawn. I'd barely slept, haunted by dreams of those glowing eyes and that relentless hum. But it wasn't the dreams that shook me the most. It was the realization that this was now my reality. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I decided to take the day off from work, claiming I was sick. It wasn't exactly a lie. I felt like I'd been run over by a freight train, my nerves frayed and my mind racing. But I wasn't sick in the usual sense. I was terrified, and for good reason. The laptop was still sitting on my kitchen table, a silent reminder of what had happened the night before. I hadn't touched it since I fled the woods, and the idea of opening it again filled me with dread. But I knew I didn't have a choice. If I was going to figure out what was going on, I needed to face whatever was waiting for me on that screen. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and opened the laptop. The screen flickered to life, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, just like before, a single line of text appeared. Report received. Proceed with the next mission. I stared at the words, my mind spinning. They knew I had been to the site. They knew what I had seen, or at least they knew I'd survived. But how? The idea that they were somehow watching me, tracking my every move, made my skin crawl. Before I could dwell on it too much, more text appeared on the screen. Subject: John Carter. Last seen 48 hours ago. Suspected abduction. Locate and report status. Below the text was a photo of a man in his mid-30s. He had a strong, square jaw with sandy hair and a warm smile. He looked like the kind of guy you'd see on a company website, the picture of normalcy. But there was something off about the photo, something in his eyes that unsettled me. They were too wide, too bright, like he was trying a little too hard to look normal. Under the photo was an address, not far from the city. My mission was clear: find John Carter and report back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a missing person case. After what I'd seen in the woods, I knew that abduction could mean something far worse than what the police usually dealt with. I spent the rest of the day preparing, trying to anticipate whatever might be waiting for me at that address. I packed a bag with the usual gear: flashlight, a few basic tools, a first aid kit. But this time, I also brought along something else. A small handgun I'd inherited from my grandfather. I'd never had much use for it before, but now it felt like a necessary precaution. By the time I arrived at the address, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. The house was unremarkable, a single-story ranch-style home with a neatly trimmed lawn and a car parked in the driveway. It looked like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened, but as I approached the front door, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The door was ajar. Just a crack, but enough to tell me that something was very wrong. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I knew I couldn't. I had a job to do, and if I wanted any chance of getting out of this alive, I needed to see it through. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in the silence. The house was dark, the only light coming from a few stray beams of the setting sun filtering through the curtains. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. "Mr. Carter," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The house felt abandoned, like no one had lived there for days. But there were signs of life. A half-eaten sandwich on the kitchen counter, a television remote left on the couch. It was as if John Carter had just vanished. I moved deeper into the house, checking each room as I went. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound my own footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The air felt heavy, charged with an unnatural stillness that set my nerves on edge. Then, as I entered the bedroom, I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. The bed was unmade, sheets tangled and tossed aside. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the symbols, the same ones I'd seen on the object in the woods, scrawled across the walls in a haphazard, almost frantic manner. They were drawn in what looked like black ink, but the lines were jagged, erratic, like they had been scratched into the wall with some kind of tool. At the foot of the bed, there was a large, dark stain on the carpet. My heart raced as I realized what it was. Blood. A lot of it. It had soaked into the fibers, dried and crusted over, leaving behind a sickening reminder of whatever had happened to her. I forced myself to move closer, trying to make sense of the scene. The symbols, the blood, it all pointed to something far worse than a simple abduction. Whatever had taken John Carter, it wasn't human, and it wasn't done with him. I was about to leave, to get out of that house and report back when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the closet. It was so quiet that at first I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, a soft, rhythmic thumping, like something was tapping against the inside of the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly approached the closet. Every instinct told me to leave, to run, and never look back. But I couldn't. I needed to know what was in there, even if it was the last thing I ever did. I reached for the closet door, my hand trembling. The tapping continued, steady and insistent, like whatever was inside knew I was coming. With a deep breath, I pulled the door open. At first, I didn't see anything. The closet was dark, the shadows thick and heavy. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it, something small and round lying on the floor. It took me a moment to realize what it was, and when I did, I nearly dropped my flashlight. It was an eyeball, a human eyeball, staring up at me with an unblinking, lifeless gaze. The tapping sound had stopped, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I didn't wait to see if there was more. I couldn't. I turned and bolted out of the house, not bothering to close the door behind me. I just ran, my feet pounding against the pavement, until I reached my car and threw myself inside. As I sped away from that house, my thoughts were a jumbled mess. What had happened to John Carter? Who or what had taken him? And what did those symbols mean? I didn't have any answers, but one thing was clear. I was in way over my head, and whatever this was, it was far from over. When I finally got back home, the laptop was waiting for me again. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to see what it had to say, but I knew I had no choice. I had to report what I had found. When the screen flickered on, there was no new mission, no instructions, just a single line of text. You are being watched. Proceed with caution. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold dread settle over me. I had been right. They were tracking me, watching my every move. But it wasn't just them. Whatever had taken John Carter was out there too, and I had a feeling it was only a matter of time before it came for me. I spent the next few days in a state of constant paranoia, jumping at every little noise and scanning the street outside my window for anything or anyone out of place. The message on the laptop had shaken me to my core. Being watched was one thing, but the idea that something beyond my understanding was involved left me feeling utterly powerless. Despite my growing fear, the rational part of me knew I needed to dig deeper. If I was going to survive this, I had to find out what I was dealing with. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized how little I actually knew. The next mission arrived without warning, just like before. This time, the message was even more cryptic. You have been chosen. Meet at 47 degrees, 24 minutes, 16.4 seconds north, 122 degrees, 12 minutes, 55.3 seconds west. Midnight. Bring nothing. I copied the coordinates into my phone, my pulse quickening as I realized where they led. An abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, near the docks. It was a place I'd heard of before, a spot known for its history of illegal activities, but now it was just another forgotten relic of the past. Or so I thought. Midnight was only a few hours away, but those hours dragged on, each second ticking by with agonizing slowness. I spent the time pacing around my apartment, trying to ignore the gnawing anxiety in my gut. The thought of going there, alone and unarmed, was terrifying, but I had no choice. Whoever, or whatever, was pulling the strings was playing a dangerous game, and I was caught in the middle. When the time finally came, I left my apartment with nothing but my phone. The drive to the warehouse felt like a journey into another world. The city's lights faded behind me, replaced by the oppressive darkness of the industrial district. As I got closer, the streets became eerily quiet, devoid of any signs of life. I parked my car a few blocks away and made the rest of the journey on foot. The warehouse loomed ahead, its hulking silhouette a stark contrast against the night sky. The air was thick with the smell of salt and rust, and every step I took echoed in the stillness. When I reached the entrance, I hesitated. The large metal door was slightly ajar, and from inside, I could hear a faint humming noise, the same sound that had haunted me since my first encounter in the woods. It was louder now, more intense, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. I pushed the doors open slowly, the metal groaning in protest. Inside, the warehouse was vast and empty, the walls lined with rusted machinery and broken crates. The only light came from a series of dim, flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete floor. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the vast space. The humming grew louder, more insistent, pulling me deeper into the building. As I moved further in, I noticed something strange. Symbols, like the ones I had seen before, scrolled on the walls in that same jagged, frantic style. They seemed to glow faintly, pulsating in time with the hum, as if they were alive. At the center of the warehouse, I found it, the source of the sound. It was a large metal structure, vaguely cylindrical, with cables and wires snaking out from its base, disappearing into the darkness. The symbols covered its surface, glowing brighter as I approached. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, to get out of there before it was too late. But something else, curiosity maybe, or some darker compulsion, kept me moving forward. As I got closer, I saw that the structure wasn't just metal. There were organic elements too, something that looked disturbingly like flesh, fused with the metal in a way that defied logic. Then, as I reached out to touch it, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. For a moment, I thought I was alone, that whatever had been calling me here had disappeared. But then I felt it, a presence, something watching me from the shadows. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness seemed to shift, and from it emerged a figure, a man, or at least something that looked like a man. He was tall, his face obscured by the shadows, but there was something deeply unsettling about him. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if he was struggling to control his own body. "Welcome," he said, his voice distorted, echoing in the empty space. "You've been chosen." "Chosen for what?" I demanded, my voice trembling. I wanted to sound brave, but I could hear the fear creeping in. "For the truth," he replied, stepping closer. As he moved into the light, I saw his face clearly for the first time. It was John Carter, or at least it used to be. His eyes, once warm and full of life, were now cold and glassy, like the life had been drained from him. And his skin, it wasn't just pale, it was translucent, almost like he was fading away. "What happened to you?" I whispered, backing away instinctively. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I've seen things you can't imagine," he said, his voice hollow. "Things that would drive you mad. But now, it's your turn." I didn't understand what he meant, but I didn't need to. The symbols on the structure began to glow even brighter, pulsating with a rhythm that matched the frantic beating of my heart. The humming returned, louder than ever, vibrating through my bones. I tried to move, to run, but I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the spot, my body paralyzed by some unseen force. The air around me seemed to warp and bend, the shadows closing in from all sides. John Carter, or whatever was left of him, continued to speak, his voice growing more distorted, more inhuman. "They've been watching us for a long time," he said, "studying us. But now, they're ready. They're coming, and there's nothing we can do to stop them." As he spoke, I saw movement in the shadows behind him, tall, thin figures, just like the one I'd seen in the woods. They moved with unnatural speed, their glowing eyes locked onto me. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to escape, but my body refused to obey. The humming grew so loud, it was deafening, drowning out all thought, all reason. The figures drew closer, surrounding me, their eyes burning into my soul. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. I had no memory of how I got there, no idea what had happened after the warehouse, but I wasn't alone. The laptop was on, the screen glowing softly in the dark. A new message awaited me. "Final mission. You must decide. Will you continue, or will you run? Choose wisely." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I didn't know what they wanted from me, or why I had been chosen, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I was being hunted, watched by forces I couldn't begin to understand, and now I had to make a choice. But no matter what I decided, one thing was certain: my life would never be the same. I spent hours staring at that message on the laptop screen, my mind swirling with a mix of dread and disbelief. The words seemed to pulse, urging me to make a choice that felt impossible. Every fiber of my being was screaming to run, to disappear, and never look back. But a smaller, more stubborn part of me, maybe the same part that had led me down this path in the first place, was unwilling to give up without knowing the truth. In the end, curiosity won out. I couldn't just walk away, not after everything I had seen. I typed a single word into the laptop. Continue. The moment I hit enter, the screen went black. I waited, my breath caught in my throat, half expecting something to leap out of the shadows. But the darkness on the screen remained, and just when I thought nothing would happen, a new message appeared, written in a font that seemed somehow more menacing, more final. Meet at 51 degrees, 44 minutes, 43.7 seconds, north, 0 degrees 0 minutes 17.3 seconds west. Come alone. Last chance. The coordinates were for a location in the middle of nowhere, far from any city or town. I didn't recognize the place, but a quick search told me all I needed to know. It was an abandoned airfield, a relic from the Cold War, now nothing more than a forgotten scar on the landscape. The perfect place for something or someone to disappear. I didn't take any chances this time. I packed my bag with everything I could think of: flashlight, extra batteries, water, my grandfather's handgun, and a few other essentials. I had a feeling this would be the last time I walked into the unknown. The drive took hours, and the further I got from civilization, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air seemed to grow heavier, the night darker, as if the world itself was trying to warn me to turn back. But I pushed on, driven by a need to see this through to the end. The airfield was exactly as I had imagined, desolate, crumbling, with weeds and vines reclaiming what little remained of the runways and buildings. The only sound was the wind whistling through the broken windows of the control tower, a haunting melody that set my teeth on edge. I parked my car at the edge of the field, the headlights slicing through the darkness. I could see the silhouette of the control tower in the distance, standing like a sentinel over the abandoned land. That's where the coordinates led, and as much as I dreaded it, I knew that's where I had to go. The walk across the field felt like an eternity. Every step echoed in the silence, the only company I had being the sound of my own breathing and the relentless beating of my heart. I reached the base of the control tower and found the door hanging off its hinges, the metal rusted and corroded by time. Inside, the tower was even more unsettling. The walls were covered in more of those symbols, scratched into the paint with a fervor that bordered on madness. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay, and every creak of the floorboards sent a jolt of fear through me. I climbed the stairs, each step bringing me closer to the top. The humming returned, faint at first, but growing louder the higher I went. By the time I reached the top, it was deafening, reverberating through the walls and floor like a living thing. At the top of the tower, I found a single room, its windows shattered and its interior covered in dust and debris. But what drew my attention wasn't the decay. It was the figure standing in the center of the room, bathed in the pale light of the moon. It was John Carter again, or at least what was left of him. His form was more distorted now, his features twisted into something barely recognizable as human. His skin was translucent, glowing faintly in the dark, and his eyes, those horrible, lifeless eyes, were locked onto me with a gaze that sent shivers down my spine. "You've come," he said, his voice echoing with an unnatural timbre. "I knew you would." I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there, my hand instinctively tightening around the grip of the gun in my pocket. "This is the end, you know," he continued, taking a step closer. "The truth you sought, it's here. But it comes with a price." "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "To join us," he replied, his smile grotesque and wrong. "To become part of something greater. They've chosen you for a reason, just as they chose me. You've seen them, felt their presence. There's no escaping it now." I shook my head, backing away from him. "Number. This isn't what I wanted. I just wanted to know the truth." "And you will," he said, his tone almost pitying. "But the truth is far more terrifying than you ever imagined. It's not just about them. It's about us, about what we are willing to become to survive." The humming grew louder, more intense, as if the whole tower was about to collapse around us. The shadows in the room began to shift, coalescing into forms that were all too familiar. Tall, thin figures with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. I realized then that there was no escape, no way out of this nightmare. The choice they had given me was an illusion, a cruel trick to see how far I would go. And now, standing on the brink of madness, I had to decide. Would I become one of them, or would I fight back, no matter the cost? With shaking hands, I pulled the gun from my pocket and aimed it at John Carter. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something almost human, a moment of recognition. "Do you really think you can stop this?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the hum. "They've already won. You're just delaying the inevitable." "Maybe," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "But I won't become one of you." Before he could respond, I pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, cutting through the hum like a knife. John Carter's body jerked, a look of shock crossing his face, before he collapsed to the floor. The figures in the shadows didn't move. They just stood there, watching, as if waiting to see what I would do next. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I had somehow ended the nightmare. But then the humming changed, shifting in pitch and tone, becoming something more sentient. The figures began to move, slowly closing in on me, their eyes burning with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I backed away, the reality of my situation crashing down on me. There was no escape, no way out. I was trapped, and they were coming for me. In a last, desperate act, I turned the gun on myself, hoping that death would be better than whatever fate awaited me. But before I could pull the trigger, the figures reached me, their cold, bony hands closing around my wrists, forcing me to drop the gun. The last thing I remember is the feeling of being pulled into the darkness, my body no longer my own, my mind slipping away into the void. The humming filled my head, drowning out all thought, all fear, until there was nothing left but the sound. And then there was silence. When I woke up, I wasn't sure if I was still alive. I was back in my apartment, the morning light streaming through the windows, as if nothing had happened. The laptop was gone, the gun nowhere to be found. Everything was just normal, but I knew it wasn't. I could feel it in the back of my mind, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. They were still with me, watching, waiting, and I was no longer the same. Something had changed, something deep inside, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it took over completely. I tried to go back to my old life, But it was impossible. The nightmares, the paranoia, they followed me everywhere. I knew that the truth I had sought was still out there, still waiting to be uncovered. But I also knew that if I continued down that path, it would destroy me. So I made a choice. I went into hiding, cutting all ties, disappearing from the world. Maybe they'll find me, maybe they won't. But for now, I'm safe. Or at least as safe as I can be. But I know this isn't the end. They're still out there, watching, waiting, and one day they'll come for me. When they do, I'll be ready. Or at least I hope I will be. But deep down, I know the truth. There's no escape. Not for me. Not for any of us. I helped cover up an alien encounter. Now they're coming for me. I guess I should start by saying that I never really believed in aliens, ghosts, or any of that paranormal stuff. I've always been a pretty grounded guy. I work a 9-to-5 job at a tech company, live in a small but decent apartment, and my idea of a wild night is watching a documentary with a beer in hand. My life was about as normal as it could get, until that damned envelope showed up. It was a Thursday, nothing special about the day. I'd just come home from work, tired and ready to zone out in front of the TV. As I unlocked my door, I noticed something odd. There was an envelope, plain and unmarked, sitting on the floor just inside my entryway. I don't remember seeing it when I left that morning. But to be honest, I wasn't fully awake then, so who knows? The envelope wasn't anything fancy, just a standard manila envelope, sealed shut with a strip of tape. There was no name, no address, nothing. Just this odd, out-of-place envelope sitting on my floor like it owned the place. Curiosity got the best of me. I tossed my bag on the couch and opened it up right there in the hallway. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. As I unfolded it, I noticed the paper was thicker than usual, almost like it was made of some kind of expensive parchment. The message was typed out in this weird, old-school font that made me think of old typewriters. Do not discuss this with anyone. Further instructions to follow. That was it. No signature, no explanation, just those words in all caps staring back at me. My first thought was that it was some kind of prank, maybe from one of the guys at work. I work in IT, and we're always pulling dumb stunts on each other to break up the monotony. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. How would they have gotten into my apartment? My door was locked, and I'm not exactly chummy with my neighbors. I was just about to crumple up the note and toss it when my phone buzzed. I pulled it out, expecting a spam text or something, but my stomach dropped when I saw the message. It was from a blocked number, and all it said was, "Check your email." I felt a chill run down my spine. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. I rushed to my laptop, fired it up, and logged into my email. My inbox was its usual mess of unread junk and work emails, but at the top, there was a new message. Like the text, it was from a blocked sender, and the subject line was blank. I hesitated for a moment, my finger hovering over the mouse, but my curiosity won out. I clicked on the email, and a single link appeared in the body of the message. No text, just this link staring back at me. My instincts screamed at me to delete the email and forget the whole thing, but I've never been great at listening to my instincts. I clicked the link. Immediately, the screen went black, and a video started playing. The quality was grainy, like it was filmed on an old camcorder, and the audio was muffled, with only a faint static hum in the background. The video was shot at night in what looked like a dense forest. The camera was shaky, bouncing around as if the person holding it was running. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling sound, almost like thunder, but deeper, more resonant. The camera jerked upwards, and for a split second, the sky was visible through the trees. That's when I saw it. A massive, dark shape hovered above the treetops, completely silent, except for that deep, gut-wrenching rumble. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, this enormous, shadowy form that blocked out the stars. And then the video cut off. Just like that. No explanation, no context, nothing. My screen went black again, and when it came back to life, the email was gone. No trace of it in my inbox, my trash, or even my spam folder. I sat there, staring at the screen, trying to process what I'd just seen. My rational mind told me it was some kind of elaborate prank, but another part of me, the part that still had goosebumps prickling my skin, wasn't so sure. I didn't know what to think, but I knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. And whatever I'd just gotten myself into, it was too late to back out now. I spent the rest of the night checking my locks, looking out the window, and trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew that something was coming, something I wasn't prepared for. And the worst part? I had no idea what it was or what it wanted with me. The next morning, I woke up to find another envelope on my doorstep. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little noise made me jump. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, even the rustle of the trees outside. My mind was on high alert, running through all the possibilities, none of them good. By the time dawn rolled around, I was exhausted, but too anxious to close my eyes for more than a few minutes at a time. When I finally dragged myself out of bed, my head was pounding, and my mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashed some cold water on my face, and tried to shake off the lingering sense of dread that clung to me like a bad smell. I told myself it was all some kind of elaborate prank, a bad joke that had gone too far. But that little voice in the back of my head wouldn't shut up. It kept whispering that something was very, very wrong. I hadn't forgotten about the envelope from the night before, or the video that had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. It all seemed so surreal, like something out of a bad horror movie. But there was no denying the fact that it had happened. I'd seen it with my own eyes, felt the cold sweat on my skin as I watched that dark shape hover above the trees. When I opened my front door, the sight of another envelope waiting for me sent a cold shiver down my spine. This one was different though. Instead of the plain manila envelope from the night before, this one was white, sealed with a thick red wax stamp. I couldn't make out the design on the stamp, just some kind of symbol, almost like a star or a flower, but not quite either. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. The envelope felt heavier than it should, as if whatever was inside carried more weight than just paper. I almost didn't want to open it, afraid of what I might find, but I knew I didn't have a choice. Inside was another piece of paper, this one thicker and rougher than the last, almost like old parchment. The message was typed out again, but this time it was longer. The words seemed to jump off the page at me, every sentence more unsettling than the last. You have been chosen. You will receive further instructions. Do not ignore them. Failure to comply will result in consequences. Underneath that, there was a string of numbers, like coordinates or a code. I didn't recognize them, but something about them made my skin crawl. I couldn't explain it, but I knew deep down that whatever this was it was serious. Deadly serious. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Who had sent the envelope? What did they mean by consequences? And what the hell was I supposed to do with those numbers? I didn't dare tell anyone about it. Not my coworkers, not my friends, not even my family. I knew, somehow, that talking about it would only make things worse. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I stayed up late, scouring the internet for anything that could explain what was happening. I found myself diving into the darker corners of the web, the places most people don't even know exist. Forums filled with conspiracy theories, old government documents, and cryptic messages that didn't make sense to anyone outside the circle of people who posted them. I didn't find any answers, just more questions. But one thing kept coming up, over and over. Stories about people who had received similar messages, strange coordinates, and warnings not to ignore them. The stories were all eerily similar, with details that sent my mind spinning in a million directions. Some people said they'd tried to follow the coordinates, only to disappear without a trace. Others claimed they were being hunted, watched by shadowy figures that seemed to know their every move. But the scariest ones were the stories that didn't end. They just stopped, as if the person telling them had suddenly vanished, leaving nothing but an unfinished post as their last mark on the world. I couldn't stop reading, even though every story made my heart pound harder in my chest. When I finally tore myself away from the screen, the sun was starting to rise again. My apartment was bathed in the pale light of early morning, but it didn't feel safe. It felt like the walls were closing in, like something was watching me from just outside my line of sight. I stood up, stretched, and tried to shake off the tension that had settled into my shoulders. That's when I noticed it. Another envelope, this time slipped under my door, just barely visible in the morning light. I didn't even hesitate this time. I snatched it up and tore it open, my heart pounding in my chest. The paper inside was the same rough parchment as before, and the message was short but clear. Tonight, 11 p.m., follow the coordinates. That was it. No threats, no warnings, just an order. And the worst part, I knew I was going to follow it. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't show up, whatever was coming would find me anyway. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting back to that envelope, those coordinates, and the unknown horror that seemed to be closing in on me. The hours ticked by in a blur, and before I knew it, the clock was creeping closer to 11 p.m. I grabbed my keys, threw on a jacket, and stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at my skin. The coordinates were plugged into my GPS, leading me to a spot I'd never been to before, an old, abandoned lot on the outskirts of town. As I drove, the feeling of dread settled deeper into my bones, a heavy weight that pressed down on my chest with every mile I traveled. When I finally arrived, the lot was exactly what I'd expected, empty, overgrown, and eerily silent. The moonlight cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt, making the place feel even more deserted. I parked the car and stepped out, my breath visible in the chilly night air, and then I saw it, a single light flickering in the distance, drawing me in like a moth to a flame. I knew, deep down, that I was stepping into something I might not be able to walk away from, but I had no choice. The coordinates had led me here, and there was no turning back now. As I made my way toward the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. that something or someone was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Every step felt like a step closer to something terrible, something I couldn't even begin to imagine. But I kept going, because what else could I do? I had no idea what was waiting for me in that dark, empty lot, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't going to let me walk away unscathed. The flickering light drew me closer, its weak glow the only thing cutting through the oppressive darkness of the abandoned lot. My footsteps echoed eerily in the silence, each one sounding louder than the last, as if the night itself was amplifying every noise. The air was thick with a tension I couldn't shake, like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I approached, the light grew brighter, revealing more of the scene before me. The source was a single lantern, old and rusted, sitting atop a weathered wooden crate in the middle of the lot. The lantern's glass was cracked, causing the flame inside to dance erratically, casting wild shadows that seemed to move on their own. Next to the crate, there was a figure standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of someone, or something, watching me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. The figure didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there, silent and unmoving. The fear that had been gnawing at me since the first envelope now gripped me like a vice, tightening with every passing second. I was on the verge of turning around and running back to my car when the figure finally stepped into the light. It was a man, tall and thin, with a face that seemed somehow wrong. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were too large, too dark, like bottomless pits that sucked in the light. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in black and white photos from the early 1900s, complete with a bowler hat that cast a shadow over his unsettling features. He smiled at me, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile a predator gives just before it pounces on its prey, all teeth and no warmth. "You've come," he said, his voice smooth and low, with a strange accent I couldn't place. "Good. We've been waiting for you." I didn't know how to respond. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped by the man's gaze and the eerie calm in his voice. What do you want?" I finally managed to stammer out, my voice barely above a whisper. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering my question. "We want the truth," he said simply, "and you're going to help us find it." I frowned, confused. "The truth? What truth? I don't know what you're talking about." The man's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, but you do," he said, his voice dripping with certainty. "You've seen things, haven't you? Things that don't make sense, things that shouldn't exist. And now, those things have seen you." My blood ran cold at his words. How did he know about the video, about the strange shapes in the sky? How did he know that ever since I'd received that first envelope, I'd felt like I was being watched, followed, hunted? Before I could ask, the man reached into his coat and pulled out a small black device, no bigger than a deck of cards. He held it out to me, and for a moment I thought about refusing, about turning and running as fast as I could. But something told me that if I didn't take it, I wouldn't make it very far. I reached out with a trembling hand and took the device. It was cold to the touch, far colder than it should have been, like it had been left in a freezer. As soon as it was in my hand, the man stepped back into the shadows, his form almost blending into the darkness. "Use it," he said, his voice now a whisper, carried on the wind, "and you will see the truth." With that, the light from the lantern flickered one last time and went out, plunging the lot into darkness. I stood there frozen, clutching the device as the night closed in around me. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind, a reminder that I was alone. But as I stood there, the device in my hand began to hum softly, a barely audible vibration that seemed to resonate with the beat of my heart. It was a strange, almost hypnotic feeling, and before I knew it, my thumb had found a small, recessed button on the side. I pressed it. The device sprang to life, the screen flickering on with a pale greenish light. At first, I didn't recognize what I was looking at, just a jumble of static and shapes that didn't make any sense. But as I stared, the image began to sharpen, revealing something that made my stomach lurch. It was the lot, the very place I was standing, but seen from above, like a drone or satellite view. In the center of the image, right where the lantern had been, there was a shape. No, several shapes, moving in the darkness. They were long and thin, like tendrils, or perhaps roots, snaking out from a central mass that pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. I realized, with a sickening jolt, that the image wasn't static. It was live, and those tendrils were moving, spreading out in all directions, as if searching for something or someone. My hands began to shake uncontrollably as I watched the tendrils move closer to where I was standing. I looked up from the screen, my eyes straining to see anything in the inky blackness around me. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty lot and the sense of something terrible lurking just out of sight. The hum from the device grew louder, more insistent, as the tendrils on the screen moved closer and closer to my position. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran, sprinting back to my car as fast as my legs would carry me. The device slipped from my grasp, falling to the ground with a dull thud. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I didn't look back as I fumbled with my keys, nearly dropping them in my panic. I finally managed to get the door open and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that it took 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. But as soon as the engine roared to life, I floored it, tearing out of the lot like a bat out of hell. I didn't stop driving until I was back in my apartment, the door locked and bolted behind me. I collapsed onto the couch, my heart still racing, my mind reeling from everything that had happened. The man, the device, those tendrils. None of it made any sense, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever I had gotten myself into, it was far from over, and I had the sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. I didn't leave my apartment for 2 days. I didn't go to work, didn't answer my phone, didn't even open the blinds. I just sat there in the dim light of my living room, trying to make sense of what had happened in that lot. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those tendrils slithering through the darkness, searching for something, or maybe someone. By the 3rd day, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was going on, what I had gotten myself into. The paranoia was eating me alive, and the feeling that I was being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it had gotten worse. I could feel eyes on me every time I moved, every time I even thought about leaving the apartment. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went back to the dark corners of the internet, the forums and chat rooms where people talked about the things that shouldn't exist. But this time, I wasn't just looking for answers. I was looking for a way out. I posted in one of the forums, describing the man in the suit, the strange device, the tendrils. I didn't give too many details, just enough to see if anyone knew what I was talking about. It felt like screaming into the void, but I didn't have any other options. I was desperate. It didn't take long to get a response. At first, it was just the usual trolls, mocking me, calling me crazy. But then, among the noise, a private message popped up in my inbox. The sender's username was just a string of random numbers and letters, nothing that made any sense. But the message itself was short and to the point. I know what you saw. Meet me. There was no address, no location, just another set of coordinates. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. More coordinates. I didn't want to go. Every instinct I had screamed at me to ignore it, to stay hidden and hope that whatever was out there would forget about me. But I knew it wouldn't. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to let me go. Not until it got what it wanted. So, against my better judgment, I copied the coordinates into my GPS and set out again. This time, the drive took me to the outskirts of the city, to an old, run-down building that looked like it hadn't seen a tenant in decades. The windows were boarded up, and the paint was peeling off in large chunks, revealing the rotting wood underneath. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. But I couldn't just sit there forever. If someone knew what was happening to me, I had to find out what they knew. It was my only chance to get out of this nightmare. I got out of the car and made my way to the entrance. The door was ajar, hanging on rusty hinges that creaked ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The floor was covered in debris, and the walls were lined with faded, peeling wallpaper. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find rats, or worse, but the only sound was the echo of my own footsteps. As I walked further into the building, I noticed something strange. The debris on the floor seemed to form a path, a narrow strip where the dust had been disturbed, leading deeper into the darkness. I followed it, my heart in my throat, until I reached a doorway at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The door was closed, but there was a faint light seeping out from underneath it, flickering like a dying candle. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Everything inside me screamed to turn around, to get the hell out of there and never look back. But I couldn't. I had to know. I opened the door. Inside, the room was small and bare, except for a single table in the center. On the table was a laptop, its screen casting a pale blue light across the room. Seated in front of the laptop was a man, his back to me, hunched over as if he was studying something intently. He was dressed in a shabby coat, his hair wild and unkempt, and he didn't react when I stepped into the room. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't respond. He just kept staring at the screen, his fingers tapping away at the keyboard with a strange, rhythmic precision. I took a cautious step forward, trying to see what he was doing. But as I got closer, a wave of nausea washed over me. The screen was displaying the same image I had seen on the device in the lot. The tendrils, moving in the darkness, getting closer and closer. "Don't get too close," the man said suddenly, his voice raspy and tired. I stopped in my tracks, startled by the sudden break in the silence. "They'll notice you if you do." "Who will notice?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What is this? What the hell is going on?" The man finally turned to look at me, and I saw his face, gaunt, pale, with deep, hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, maybe weeks. "You've seen them, haven't you?" he asked, his voice a harsh whisper. "The shadows, the things that move in the dark." I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. "They're not from here," he said, turning back to the screen. "They're not from anywhere we can understand. They're searching, and once they've seen you, they won't stop, not until they've found what they're looking for." I felt a cold dread settle in my gut. "What are they looking for?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The man shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "But I do know that they've been doing this for a long time. They find people like you, like me, and they test us. They watch us, see how we react. And if they decide you're not what they're looking for..." He trailed off, his eyes fixed on the screen, where the tendrils had almost reached the center of the lot. I didn't need him to finish the sentence. I could guess what happened to the people who didn't measure up. "What do I do?" I asked, desperate for some kind of answer, some way out of this nightmare. "How do I make them stop?" The man looked at me again, his hollow eyes filled with something that might have been pity. "You can't," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "All you can do is wait. Wait, and hope they lose interest." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been hoping for some kind of solution, some way to escape this madness, but instead, I was being told that there was nothing I could do. I was at the mercy of these things, whatever they were, and all I could do was wait for them to decide my fate. I didn't want to believe him. I couldn't accept that there was no way out. But deep down, I knew he was right. There was no escape from this, no way to fight back. The man must have seen the despair on my face, because he sighed and reached into his coat, pulling out a small worn notebook. "Here," he said, handing it to me. "This might help. It's everything I've learned about them, everything I've tried. Maybe you'll find something in there that I missed." I took the notebook with the trembling hands, the worn leather cover rough under my fingers. It felt like a lifeline, the only thing standing between me and whatever those things had planned for me. "Thank you," I said, though the words felt hollow. The man just nodded and turned back to his laptop, his attention already shifting back to the screen. "Be careful," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the hum of the computer. "They're always watching." I left the building, the notebook clutched tightly in my hand, my mind racing with everything the man had told me. I knew now that I wasn't alone, that others had been through this before me, but that didn't make it any easier. If anything, it made it worse. Because if they hadn't found a way out, what chance did I have? As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something was watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something lurking behind me, but there was nothing, just the empty road and the darkness pressing in from all sides. When I finally got back to my apartment, I bolted the door and drew all the blinds, plunging the room into darkness. The notebook sat on the table in front of me, its presence both comforting and terrifying. It held the answers I was looking for, but I wasn't sure I was ready to face them. But I knew I didn't have a choice. If I wanted to survive this, I had to know what I was dealing with. I had to understand what these things wanted, why they had chosen me, and most importantly, how I could make them go away. I sat in the darkness of my apartment, the notebook in front of me like some ancient forbidden tome. The silence was oppressive, the air thick with the weight of everything I'd learned. My mind raced with the fragments of information I'd gathered, pieces of a puzzle I was desperate to solve. The man in the abandoned building had warned me that there was no way out, but I refused to accept that. There had to be something, some clue hidden within those worn pages that could help me escape this nightmare. I took a deep breath and opened the notebook. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, almost illegible in some places, as if the author had been in too much of a hurry to write clearly. Diagrams, symbols, and sketches filled the margins, all of them unfamiliar and unsettling. But it was the words that caught my attention, the details of encounters, warnings, and desperate attempts to communicate with whatever was out there. The first few entries were from years ago, back when the author had first noticed something was wrong. He wrote about strange lights in the sky, mysterious figures appearing in his dreams, and the growing sense of being watched. At first, he thought he was losing his mind, but then the envelopes started showing up, just like they had for me. As I flipped through the pages, the entries grew more frantic, more desperate. The author had tried everything, moving to different cities, cutting off all contact with the outside world, even burning the envelopes before he could open them. But nothing worked. The things, whatever they were, always found him. They always sent more instructions, more demands. Then I found the page that made my blood run cold. It was an entry written just a few weeks ago, and it was different from the rest. The handwriting was shaky, the words barely legible, but the message was clear. The author had finally figured out what the tendrils were, what they wanted. They're not just watching, the entry read. They're searching for something inside us, something they need, and when they find it, they take it. My hands trembled as I read the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. What could they possibly want from me? What could I have that these things, these alien entities, would need? And then, as if in answer to my question, my phone buzzed. The sound was jarring in the oppressive silence, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I picked it up with shaking hands, expecting another message from a blocked number, another cryptic set of instructions. But it wasn't a text. It was a video call request from an unknown number. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. Every instinct I had screamed at me to ignore it, to throw the phone across the room and pretend I hadn't seen it. But I knew deep down that I couldn't. If I didn't answer, they would come for me, just like they had come for the others. With a deep breath, I accepted the call. The screen flickered to life, and for a moment, all I could see was static. Then the image resolved, and I found myself staring into the face of the man from the lot, the same man who had given me the device, with the pale skin and hollow eyes. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, in the shadows, were shapes, vague, indistinct, but undeniably there. They shifted and writhed, just out of focus, like they were made of smoke or mist. And as they moved, I realized with a sickening jolt that they weren't shadows at all. They were the tendrils, the same ones I had seen on the screen, twisting and coiling around the man like they were alive. "You've been chosen," the man said, his voice distorted, as if coming from a great distance. "It's time." "Time for what?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The man smiled, but it was a cold, empty smile. "You have something they need," he said. "Something inside you, something they've been searching for. And now they found it." I shook my head, backing away from the phone as if that could somehow distance me from the horror unfolding on the screen. "I don't understand," I whispered. "What are you talking about? What do I have that they want?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside, revealing more of the tendrils. They pulsed and writhed, their movements almost hypnotic, as if they were alive. And then, slowly, they began to take shape, forming into something that resembled a face, an alien, inhuman face, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. "You," the face whispered, its voice echoing inside my head, bypassing my ears entirely. "You are the key." The room spun around me, and I felt a wave of nausea crash over me. The words didn't make sense, but I could feel the truth of them deep in my bones. Somehow, in some way I couldn't comprehend, I was connected to these things. They had been searching for something inside me, and now they had found it. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "No, this can't be happening." But it was. The face on the screen pulsed with a sickly glow, the tendrils reaching out toward me, even through the phone. I could feel their cold presence in the room with me, could feel them brushing against my skin, even though I knew they weren't physically there. They were inside my mind, inside my very soul. "Accept it," the face whispered, its voice soothing, almost comforting. "There is no escape. You were chosen long ago, and now your time has come. We will take what we need, and then you will be free." I wanted to fight, to scream, to run as far away as I could, but I knew there was no point. They had found me, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. My body was frozen, my mind paralyzed by the sheer terror of what was happening. And then, without warning, the screen went black. The call was over. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the blank screen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the room was silent, empty, as if the entire world was holding its breath. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting for the end. Minutes, hours, time seemed to stretch and warp, losing all meaning. And then, finally, I felt it. The cold tendrils of something slipping into my mind, into my very being. It was like a door had been opened inside me, a door I hadn't even known was there. And through that door, they came. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The world around me faded, and all that was left was the darkness and the cold, inhuman presence that wrapped itself around me, consuming everything I was, everything I would ever be. And in that final moment, as I felt myself slipping away, I understood the truth. I had never been alone. They had always been with me, waiting, watching, until the time was right. I was the key, the answer to a question I couldn't comprehend. And now that they had what they wanted, I was no longer needed. But even as I faded into nothingness, a part of me remained, a tiny spark of consciousness clinging to the last vestiges of my humanity. I realized that this was not the end, not really. I was still here, still aware, still a part of something much larger than myself. I had been chosen, and now I was one of them. And somewhere, in the darkness, I knew that they would continue their search, continue their hunt. They would find others, just like they had found me, because they were always watching, and they would never stop. I was part of a government team studying extraterrestrial life. The creatures we found are not friendly. I've never been one to believe in aliens, ghosts, or any of that paranormal stuff. I'm a scientist by training, and I've always grounded myself in facts, logic, and the evidence at hand. But something happened to me a few years ago that I can't fully explain. I'm sharing this here because I feel like people need to know, even if it sounds far-fetched. It started with an email. I was sitting in my cluttered office, hunched over my computer, when a new message popped up in my inbox. It was from an unknown sender, with a subject line, "Job opportunity, confidential." I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam, but curiosity got the better of me. I clicked it open, and what I read changed the course of my life forever. The email was brief, almost cryptic. It didn't explain much, just that a private government contractor had an opening for someone with my exact skill set. Biology with a focus on cellular regeneration. The pay was absurdly good, and the work, it said, was of national importance. There was a confidentiality agreement I had to sign just to get more information. I hesitated. It all felt off, like some elaborate scam. But after rereading the email a dozen times, I started to convince myself that it might be legitimate. I've been in the field long enough to know that unusual job offers pop up every now and then, especially when you've specialized in something as niche as cellular biology. Maybe some defense project needed a biologist. Maybe they'd found some new pathogen. I didn't know, but my curiosity won out. I signed the NDA and sent it back. Within the hour, I received a reply with more details and a request for a phone interview. The name of the contractor was unfamiliar, but they claimed to have deep ties to several three-letter agencies. They assured me that the work was legal, though classified. The project, they said, would involve studying newly discovered life forms. That was all they could tell me over the phone. I'd have to go to the facility to learn more. I flew out 2 days later to a small town in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in the desert southwest. From there, I was driven to a remote facility, heavily guarded and surrounded by nothing but miles of desolate land. The place looked like something straight out of a conspiracy theory, a concrete bunker with no windows and security tighter than any place I'd ever seen. Once inside, I was led to a room where a man in a suit was waiting for me. He introduced himself as Director Collins and started explaining the project. "This is going to sound unbelievable," he said, sitting across from me with a grave expression. "But what I'm about to tell you is the truth." He paused, as if giving me one last chance to back out. But I was too deep into this now. "Our team has been tasked with studying life forms that are not from Earth," he continued, "extraterrestrial, to be specific. We've recovered a few specimens, and your job would be to study their cellular structure with a particular focus on how they heal." I must have sat there in stunned silence for a long time, because Collins eventually asked if I was okay. "Aliens? Like actual aliens?" I finally managed to stammer. He nodded. "We've known about their existence for some time now. These creatures, they're unlike anything we've ever seen, and frankly, we're not sure how dangerous they are." I was skeptical. This had to be some kind of joke, right? But the seriousness in Collins's eyes told me otherwise. I don't know why, but something deep inside me told me that he wasn't lying. Maybe it was the setting, the heavy security, or the way he spoke about these creatures with a kind of reverence mixed with fear. Whatever it was, I found myself agreeing to the job. For the next few hours, I was briefed on the project. The facility had several levels, and the specimens were kept in a secure underground lab. They hadn't been able to communicate with them, and any attempts to understand their origins had failed. My task was to figure out how these creatures could regenerate cells so quickly. Apparently, they could heal from injuries that would be fatal to any known organism on Earth. As I was led to my quarters, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just signed my life away to something far more dangerous than I could comprehend. The whole thing felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. That night, I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the facility's ventilation system. My mind was racing. Aliens? Really? But the reality of the situation didn't truly hit me until the next day, when I was taken to the lab to see the specimens for myself. And that's when things started to get really strange. The next morning, I was woken up early by a sharp knock on my door. A guard stood outside, his face expressionless, as he motioned for me to follow. I didn't have time to shower or even think before I was escorted down several levels deeper into the facility. The further we descended, the colder it got, and I could feel the weight of the earth pressing down on us. The corridors were narrow, and the walls were lined with reinforced steel, giving the impression that whatever was kept down here was something they were desperate to contain. We finally arrived at a pair of heavy, double-sealed doors. The guard pressed his hand against a scanner, and the door slid open with a low hiss, revealing a sterile white room filled with various high-tech equipment. There were several other scientists already inside, each absorbed in their work. None of them even looked up when I entered. In the center of the room were 3 large glass containment units. They were heavily reinforced with layers of what looked like bulletproof glass and metal plating. Inside each one was something I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. The first specimen was vaguely humanoid in shape, but its proportions were all wrong. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, but with limbs that were too long and thin, almost spindly. Its skin was a mottled gray, with a texture that reminded me of dried leather. The head was the most unsettling part, large and bulbous, with deep, hollow eye sockets. But the eyes weren't missing. They were just deep inside, staring out like 2 tiny black dots. The second one was completely different. It was smaller, more compact, and it looked almost insect-like. Its body was segmented, with a shiny chitinous exoskeleton that reflected the harsh lights of the lab. It had multiple legs, all of which ended in sharp, claw-like appendages. But the strangest part was its head, or what I assumed was its head. It didn't have any discernible eyes, just a mass of writhing tentacles where its face should be. The third creature was the most disturbing. It was larger than the others, with a body that seemed to shift and change as I watched it. It didn't have a solid form, more like a mass of flesh and muscle that was constantly rearranging itself. At times, it would sprout limbs, only to have them dissolve back into its body moments later. It was like it couldn't decide what shape to take. As I stared at the creatures, a cold dread settled over me. There was something inherently wrong about them, something that made my skin crawl just by being in the same room. These weren't just animals from another planet. They were something else entirely, something that defied all the rules of biology that I knew. A scientist who introduced himself as Dr. Harris approached me and handed me a tablet with data on the specimens. His face was pale, and there was a nervous energy about him that I couldn't quite place. They don't communicate in any way we understand, he said quietly, his eyes flicking nervously toward the containment units. We've tried everything. Languages, symbols, even chemical signals. Nothing works. It's like they're aware of us, but they don't acknowledge us. What do you mean? I asked, still unable to tear my eyes away from the writhing mass in the third unit. They don't respond to stimuli the way we'd expect. It's like they're in their own world, operating on a different level of consciousness. We've even tried causing them pain to see how they'd react. That caught my attention. And Dr. Harris looked even more uneasy. The first two, they healed almost instantly. No matter what we did, within seconds, the wounds would close up as if they were never there. But the third one, it's different. It doesn't heal the same way. It changes instead. I frowned, not understanding. Changes? He nodded. When we injure it, it doesn't just heal. It adapts. The injury becomes a new part of it, like it's absorbing the damage and using it to evolve. I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd studied cellular regeneration extensively, but this was something far beyond anything I'd ever encountered. Regeneration was one thing, but adaptation like that, it was almost as if the creature was learning, growing stronger with every attempt to harm it. Is it dangerous? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Harris hesitated, then nodded slowly. We think so. We've had to reinforce the containment unit multiple times. It keeps testing the boundaries, pushing against the glass, looking for weaknesses. As he spoke, I noticed the third creature shift again, its form twisting into something vaguely resembling a human arm, but grotesquely elongated and ending in sharp, pointed claws. It reached out, pressing against the glass with a sickening squelch. The glass held, but the sound it made was enough to send a wave of nausea through me. I took a step back, trying to shake the feeling of unease that was settling in the pit of my stomach. There was a nagging thought at the back of my mind, something I didn't want to acknowledge, but it was there, growing stronger with every passing second. What happens if it gets out? I asked, my voice barely steady. Dr. Harris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the room, as if to make sure no one else was listening, then leaned in closer to me. That's what we're trying to prevent, he whispered. But if it does, we don't know. We're not sure we can contain it. I stared at the creature, watching as it shifted once more, its body rippling and changing shape, like something out of a nightmare. And for the first time since I had arrived at the facility, I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of dread, because in that moment I realized that we weren't just studying these creatures, we were trying to keep them from escaping. The days that followed were a blur of routine and growing tension. I spent hours in the lab, analyzing samples from the creatures, trying to make sense of their biology. The more I learned, the less I understood. Their cellular structures were unlike anything I'd ever seen, complex beyond comprehension, with layers upon layers of DNA that seemed to shift and change, almost as if they were alive in a way that was different from any life on Earth. The other scientists were just as perplexed. We held daily meetings poring over the data, but every answer we found led to more questions. The creatures weren't just surviving in their containment, they were thriving. It was like they were adapting to the environment we had placed them in, becoming stronger, more resilient. And then there was the third specimen, the one that could adapt to injuries. It was becoming more aggressive. Every day, it pushed harder against the boundaries of its containment, testing the glass, searching for weaknesses. The reinforced glass had held so far, but we all knew it was only a matter of time before it found a way out. The unease in the facility was palpable. The guards, who had once stood casually at their posts, now carried their weapons with a tense grip. The scientists spoke in hushed tones, glancing nervously at the containment units as if they expected the creatures to burst out at any moment. Even Director Collins, who had seemed so confident when I first arrived, had a permanent frown etched on his face. It was around that time that I started having nightmares. Every night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The dreams were always the same. I was standing in the lab alone when the third creature broke free. It would shift and twist, growing larger and more monstrous until it was towering over me, its claws reaching out to tear me apart. But just before it struck, I'd wake up gasping for breath. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just stress, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I wasn't the only one. Dr. Harris mentioned that he hadn't slept properly in days, and some of the other scientists had started to look as haggard as I felt. We were all on edge, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. It was late at night, and I was in the lab alone, running tests on a sample from the second creature. The facility was quiet. The only sound, the hum of the equipment, and the occasional beep from the monitoring systems. I'd grown used to the silence, even found it comforting in a strange way. But that night it felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. I was about to wrap up for the night when the lights flickered. It was just a brief, stuttering blink, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I looked up from my work, staring at the overhead lights as they stabilized. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I was about to call it a night when the alarms went off. The sound was deafening, a blaring, high-pitched wail that echoed through the corridors. My first thought was that it was a drill. Maybe they were testing the system, or there was a minor malfunction. But then I heard the screams. It wasn't the panicked shouting of people evacuating. These were screams of pure, unfiltered terror coming from somewhere deep within the facility. My stomach dropped, and without thinking, I ran toward the source of the noise. I burst into the main containment area just in time to see it happen. The third creature, the one we all feared, had broken free. The reinforced glass that had held it for so long lay shattered on the floor, glistening in the harsh light like a bed of ice shards. The creature itself was in the center of the room, its form shifting and pulsing with a sickening fluidity. It had already taken out 2 guards. Their bodies were lying on the ground, twisted and broken, as if they'd been torn apart by something with immense strength. The other guards were firing at it, their bullets tearing into its flesh, but it didn't seem to care. Every wound they inflicted only made it stronger, its body absorbing the damage and using it to grow, to change. It was monstrous now, its shape no longer even remotely humanoid. It had become something else entirely, a mass of writhing flesh and tendrils that lashed out at anything that moved. I watched in horror as one of the scientists, someone I'd worked with just that morning, was grabbed by the creature and pulled into its mass. His scream was cut short as the creature engulfed him, absorbing him into its shifting form. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that thing as possible, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was watch as the creature continued to grow, feeding off the destruction it was causing. And out of nowhere, Director Collins appeared, barking orders at the remaining guards. They didn't stand a chance, but they followed his commands anyway, firing at the creature with everything they had. Collins grabbed my arm and dragged me out of the room, shouting something I couldn't hear over the noise. We ran through the corridors, the alarm still blaring in our ears. I didn't know where we were going, and I didn't care. All I wanted was to get away from that thing, to put as much distance between it and me as possible. We eventually reached a secure room, a panic room, I realized. Collins shoved me inside, slamming the door shut behind us. The walls were thick, and the noise outside was muffled, but I could still hear the faint sounds of gunfire and screams. I collapsed against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing with what I'd just witnessed. Collins was pacing, running a hand through his hair, his face pale and drawn. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "We had protocols, contingency plans." "What the hell is that thing?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaking. Collins stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. "I don't know," he admitted. "We thought we could control it, study it, but it's more than just a creature. It's evolving." The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. Evolving. That thing wasn't just adapting, it was becoming something else, something far more dangerous than we'd anticipated. "We need to contain it," Collins said, his voice trembling. "We need to stop it before it gets out. Before it gets out." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were miles underground in a facility designed to contain the uncontainable, and yet here we were, hiding in a panic room while that thing rampaged through the lab. If it could break through reinforced glass, what was to stop it from breaking through the walls, from finding its way to the surface? And if it did get out, what then? I didn't have an answer. Neither did Collins. All we could do was wait and hope that the creature didn't find us, that the guards could somehow contain it before it was too late. But deep down, I knew the truth. We were dealing with something far beyond our understanding, something that couldn't be contained, and it was only a matter of time before it found a way out. We sat in that panic room for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. The walls were thick, but I could still hear the chaos outside, the muffled shouts, the distant thuds of something heavy crashing to the ground, the occasional sharp crack of gunfire. It was all a terrifying blur, and every sound made me flinch. My mind was racing with thoughts of that creature, of what it might be doing, how close it might be to finding us. Director Collins was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself, his face pale and drawn. I could tell he was trying to come up with a plan, but the truth was, there wasn't much we could do. We were trapped, just as much as that creature was supposed to be. But the difference was that we were supposed to be safe in this room. Somehow, that didn't make me feel any better. Then without warning, the door to the panic room started to shake. It was subtle at first, just a faint vibration that I might have missed if I hadn't been so on edge. But then it grew stronger, more insistent. I could feel the metal vibrating under my feet, and the door itself started to bend inward, like something was pushing against it from the other side. Collins stopped pacing and stared at the door, his eyes wide with fear. "It's found us," he whispered, more to himself than to me. The door continued to buckle, the metal groaning under the pressure. I could hear something scraping against it, something sharp, like claws or metal tools. The sound was grating, piercing, and it set my teeth on edge. I backed up against the far wall, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out, but there was nowhere to go. Collins grabbed a nearby emergency kit, fumbling with the latch as he pulled out a small handheld device. It looked like a detonator, with a single red button in the center. He turned to me, his face grim. "If it gets through, I'm going to blow the facility." I stared at him, not comprehending. "Blow the facility?" He nodded. "There's an emergency protocol. If containment fails, we're supposed to detonate the core. It'll destroy everything within a 5-mile radius, including us." The reality of what he was saying hit me like a freight train. If that creature broke through the door, our only option was to destroy the entire facility, to sacrifice ourselves, to stop it from escaping. I felt a surge of panic, my hands trembling as I realized just how close we were to total annihilation. The door continued to bend inward, the scraping sound growing louder, more frantic. Whatever was on the other side was relentless, determined to get in. I could almost feel its presence, something dark and malevolent pressing against the door, eager to break through, to consume us. Collins held the detonator tightly, his thumb hovering over the button. "We can't let it out," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No matter what." And then, just as the door seemed like it would give way, the noise stopped. The vibration ceased, and the door stilled. For a moment there was silence, a heavy, oppressive silence that hung in the air like a shroud. I held my breath, waiting, dreading what might happen next, but nothing did. The door remained intact, and the scraping sound was gone. Collins and I exchanged a wary glance, neither of us daring to speak. The quiet was almost worse than the noise. It was the calm before the storm, and we both knew it. Slowly, Collins approached the door, his hand shaking as he reached for the handle. I wanted to scream at him to stop, to leave it alone, but I couldn't find my voice. He hesitated for a moment, then turned the handle ever so slightly, just enough to peer through the narrow gap. What he saw made him recoil in horror, his face going even paler than before. "It's gone," he whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't understand. Gone? How could it be gone? But when I looked through the gap, I saw it too. The corridor outside was empty, no sign of the creature anywhere. The walls were scarred and gouged, deep claw marks etched into the metal, but the creature itself was nowhere to be seen. For a brief moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe it had been driven off. Maybe the guards had managed to contain it after all. But that hope was short-lived, crushed by the sight of something far more disturbing. Blood. Dark, glistening blood smeared across the floor, leading away from the door and down the corridor. But it wasn't human blood. It was thick, almost black, with a strange iridescent sheen that made it seem unnatural, alien, and there was a lot of it. Collins and I stared at the trail of blood, neither of us daring to move. It was as if the creature had been wounded, hurt badly enough to leave a trail as it retreated. But if it was bleeding, that meant it could be hurt, right? It wasn't invincible after all. But that thought didn't bring me any comfort. If anything, it made me more afraid, because if the creature was injured, it would only become more desperate, more dangerous, and it was still out there, somewhere in the facility, lurking in the shadows. Collins took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "We need to get to the control room," he said. "We have to find out what's going on." I nodded, too shaken to argue. We slipped out of the panic room, following the trail of blood down the corridor. The facility was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the ventilation system. The lights flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows on the walls, but there was no sign of the creature. As we made our way through the maze of corridors, the sense of dread grew stronger. The facility felt like a tomb, cold and lifeless, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every corner we turned, I expected to see the creature waiting for us, ready to strike. We finally reached the control room, a large, heavily fortified area filled with monitors and control panels. It was empty, the chairs overturned, as if the staff had left in a hurry. Collins rushed to the main console, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he pulled up the security feeds. The monitors flickered to life, showing various parts of the facility. Some of the feeds were static, the cameras destroyed or malfunctioning, but others were still operational. What I saw on those screens will haunt me for the rest of my life. Bodies, dozens of bodies, strewn across the floors of the facility. Guards, scientists, all of them torn apart, their remains scattered like broken dolls. The creature had left a trail of destruction in its wake, and there was no one left to stop it. But the worst part was the creature itself. It was on one of the screens, dragging itself through a corridor, leaving a smear of blood behind it. It was barely recognizable now, its form twisted and mangled, but it was still alive, still moving. It had lost its humanoid shape entirely, becoming something more monstrous, more grotesque. It was like a mass of flesh and bone, constantly shifting and changing, as if it was trying to rebuild itself, and it was heading towards the exit. Collins cursed under his breath, his face a mask of panic. "We have to stop it," he said, his voice shaking. "If it gets out, we're all dead." He pulled up the facility's lockdown protocols, his hands trembling as he activated the emergency containment measures. Heavy doors began to slam shut across the facility, cutting off the creature's path. But it was fast, too fast. It managed to slip through the closing doors, its body contorting and twisting in ways that defied logic. "We can't let it reach the surface," Collins muttered, more to himself than to me. He typed in a series of commands, and I saw the screen flash with a warning. Self-destruct sequence activated. My heart sank. This was it, the last resort. If we couldn't contain the creature, we'd have to destroy the entire facility, along with everyone and everything in it. Collins looked at me, his eyes filled with desperation. "We have 10 minutes, he said. "We need to get to the escape pods." We sprinted through the corridors, the alarms blaring in our ears, the countdown ticking down in the back of my mind. The facility was a maze, but Collins seemed to know where he was going, leading us through the twisting hallways as fast as he could. All the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was right behind us, hunting us down. We finally reached the escape pods, a small cramped chamber with only a few remaining pods. Collins shoved me into one, then climbed into the other. The doors sealed shut, and I could hear the hiss of the pressurization system as the pod prepared for launch. The countdown was at 3 minutes when the pod launched. I felt the jolt as it shot up through the escape tunnel, the pressure pushing me back into my seat. My heart was pounding, my mind racing with everything that had happened, but all I could do was wait as the pod ascended toward the surface. As we broke through the earth and into the night sky, I felt a momentary sense of relief. We had made it. We were alive. But then I saw it. In the distance, far below, The escape pod shot through the darkness, the distant lights of the facility growing smaller as we ascended into the night sky. For a moment, there was a sense of weightlessness, a fleeting illusion of safety, but that was shattered as I looked out of the small circular window and saw it, the thing I feared most. Below us, in the inky blackness of the desert night, I could see the creature. It wasn't dead. It wasn't even close. Somehow, against all odds, it had made it to the surface. Its grotesque, shifting form was unmistakable, even from this distance. It was larger now, its body swollen and twisted, barely resembling anything that could be called a living being. It looked more like a mass of writhing shadows and flesh, oozing and crawling across the ground like some nightmare brought to life. And it was moving, slowly, inexorably. It was heading away from the facility, toward the nearest town, a town filled with unsuspecting people who had no idea what was coming for them. My stomach churned at the thought, my mind racing with horror at the implications. The creature was out. It was free. I could see the lights of the facility flickering as the countdown neared 0. A few seconds later, the ground below erupted in a massive explosion. The blast was blinding, a brilliant flash of light that lit up the desert for miles around. The shockwave hit the pod, sending it rocking violently as it continued its ascent. For a brief moment, I dared to hope that the explosion had destroyed the creature, that the sheer force of the blast had been enough to obliterate it. But as the light faded and the dust settled, I saw the truth. It was still moving. The explosion had slowed it down, torn chunks of its twisted mass away. But it was still alive, still crawling, still heading toward the town. It was relentless, unstoppable. My blood ran cold as the realization set in. Nothing we had done had been enough. The self-destruct, the reinforced containment, the countless measures designed to protect the world from what lay beneath the earth. None of it had worked. The creature was beyond anything we had ever imagined. Something that couldn't be killed. Something that couldn't be stopped. As the pod continued to climb, I could see the town in the distance, its lights twinkling like stars on the horizon. I thought of the people there, going about their lives, completely unaware of the horror that was creeping toward them. They had no idea that their world was about to be torn apart, that something unimaginable was about to descend upon them. Collins's voice crackled through the communication system, bringing me back to the present. "We need to alert the authorities," he said, his voice strained with exhaustion and fear. "We need to warn them before it's too late." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I knew he was right, but I also knew that it wouldn't be enough. How could we warn them about something like this? How could we make them understand the gravity of the situation, the sheer terror of what was coming? The pod began its final approach, the ground rushing up to meet us. My hands were trembling as I gripped the sides of the seat, my mind racing with what we would do next. How could we stop this thing? How could we protect the world from a creature that seemed to defy every law of nature, every boundary of science? The pod landed with a heavy thud, the hatch popping open to reveal the night air. I stumbled out, my legs weak, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. Collins was right behind me, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with fear. We were in a remote part of the desert, far from the nearest town. The stars overhead were cold and distant, and the only sound was the faint hum of the pod's cooling systems. But in the distance, I could still see the creature, still moving, still crawling towards civilization. "There's no time to lose," Collins said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to contact the military, get them to evacuate the area, contain the creature before it reaches the town." I nodded again, numbly following him, as he made his way to a nearby outpost, a small, nondescript building that had been set up as part of the facility's emergency protocols. Inside, there was a communication terminal, a direct line to the nearest military base. Collins began frantically typing in codes, his fingers shaking as he activated the emergency beacon. I stood by, useless, my mind still struggling to process everything that had happened. I could hear his voice as he spoke into the terminal, his words clipped and urgent as he relayed the situation to the higher-ups. But even as he spoke, I knew it wouldn't be enough. The creature was too strong, too fast, too resilient. It had survived everything we'd thrown at it, and now it was free, loose in the world, with nothing to stop it. The minutes ticked by as Collins continued his frantic communication. I glanced at the monitors, which still showed a live feed from a satellite overhead. The creature was closer to the town now, its massive, shifting form leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. And then suddenly, it stopped. I frowned, leaning in closer to the screen. The creature had paused, its body convulsing and rippling as if in pain. For a moment, I thought maybe the explosion had finally caught up to it, that maybe it was dying. But then, with a sickening lurch, it began to change again. The mass of flesh and shadows started to contract, shrinking in on itself, becoming smaller, more compact. It was as if the creature was reversing its own evolution, shedding the monstrous form it had taken on. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched, horrified, as it shrank further until it was no larger than a human. And then, impossibly, it stood up. The creature had taken on a new form, one that was eerily familiar. It was human now, or at least it looked human, but there was something wrong about it, something off. Its movements were too fluid, too smooth, and its skin was too perfect, too flawless, like a mannequin brought to life. It stood there for a moment, as if testing its new form, then began walking toward the town, its movements eerily calm, almost purposeful. I couldn't breathe. The creature wasn't just evolving, it was learning, adapting to the world around it. It had taken on a form that would allow it to blend in, to move among people unnoticed. It was no longer just a monster. It was something far more insidious, something that could hide in plain sight. "We're too late," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Collins looked up from the terminal, his eyes wide with terror as he saw the screen. "Oh God," he muttered. "What have we done?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the creature was out there somewhere, walking among us, and we had no way of stopping it, no way of knowing where it might strike next. The last thing I saw before the screen went dark was the creature, disappearing into the shadows of the town. It was gone, lost in the sea of humanity, free to do whatever it wanted, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that we had unleashed something far worse than we could ever have imagined, something that would haunt the world for years to come. I'm sharing this because people need to know the truth, because even now, as I sit here, writing this, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting, and when it strikes again, it'll be too late for all of us.